Welcome to the Thought Echo channel. I'm so glad you're joining me for story time today. Whether you're here to relax, learn, or just immerse yourself in a wonderful tale, you're in for a treat. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can join me for more stories and inspiration. Let's begin.
Step into a world where imagination knows no bounds, a world of red sands, twin moons, and ancient civilizations. A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs isn't just a story. It's an epic journey to the mysterious planet of Mars, or as its inhabitants call it, Barsoom. Follow the incredible tale of John Carter, a soldier of Earth who finds himself mysteriously transported to this alien world. There, amidst towering cities and endless deserts, he encounters strange creatures, fierce warriors, and the beautiful yet brave Dejathoris, a princess unlike any other. This timeless classic blends adventure, romance, and science fiction in a way that has captivated readers for over a century. As you listen, prepare to lose yourself in a Martian world where bravery, honor, and love collide against a backdrop of interplanetary war and discovery. So sit back, close your eyes, and let the story of a princess of Mars carry you to a place far beyond our world. A place where heroes are made and legends are born. Let's begin. Chapter 1. On the Arizona Hills. I am a very old man. How old, I do not know. Possibly I am 100, possibly more, but I cannot tell because I have never aged as other men, nor do I remember any childhood. So far as I can recollect, I have always been a man of about 30. I appear today as I did 40 years and more ago, and yet I feel that I cannot go on living forever, that someday I shall die the real death, from which there is no resurrection. I do not know why I should fear death, I who have died twice and am still alive. But yet I have the same horror of it as you who have never died. It is because of this terror of death, I believe, that I am so convinced of my mortality. And because of this conviction, I have determined to write down the story of the interesting periods of my life and of my death. I cannot explain the phenomena, I can only set down here, in the words of an ordinary soldier of fortune, a chronicle of the strange events that befell me during the 10 years that my dead body lay undiscovered in an Arizona cave. I have never told this story, nor shall mortal man see this manuscript until after I have passed over for eternity. I know that the average human mind will not believe what it cannot grasp, and so I do not purpose being pilloried by the public, the pulpit, and the press, and held up as a colossal liar when I am but telling the simple truths which someday science will substantiate. Possibly, the suggestions which I gained upon Mars, and the knowledge I can set down in this chronicle, will aid in an earlier understanding of the mysteries of our sister planet. Mysteries to you, but no longer mysteries to me. My name is John Carter. I am better known as Captain Jack Carter of Virginia. At the close of the Civil War, I found myself possessed of several $100,000 Confederate currency, and a captain's commission in the cavalry arm of an army which no longer existed, the servant of a state which had vanished with the hopes of the South. Masterless, penniless, and with my only means of livelihood fighting gone, I determined to work my way to the Southwest and attempt to retrieve my fallen fortunes in a search for gold. I spent nearly a year prospecting in the company of another Confederate officer, Captain James K. Powell of Richmond. We were extremely fortunate, for late in the winter of 1865, after many hardships and privations, we located the most remarkable gold-bearing quartz vein that our wildest dreams had ever pictured. Powell, who was a mining engineer by education, stated that we had uncovered over $1 million worth of ore in a trifle over 3 months. As our equipment was crude in the extreme, we decided that one of us must return to civilization, purchase the necessary machinery, and return with a sufficient force of men properly to work the mine. As Powell was familiar with the country, as well as with the mechanical requirements of mining, we determined it would be best for him to make the trip. It was agreed that I was to hold down our claim against the remote possibility of its being jumped by some wandering prospector. On March 3, 1866, Powell and I packed his provisions on two of our burros, and, bidding me goodbye, he mounted his horse and started down the mountainside toward the valley, across which lay the first stage of his journey. The morning of Powell's departure was, like nearly all Arizona mornings, clear and beautiful. I could see him and his little pack animals picking their way down the mountainside toward the valley, and all during the morning I would catch occasional glimpses of them as they topped a ridge or came out upon a level plateau. My last sight of Powell was about 3 in the afternoon, as he entered the shadows of the range on the opposite side of the valley. Some half an hour later, I happened to glance casually across the valley and was much surprised to note 3 little dots in about the same place I had last seen my friend and his 2 pack animals. I am not given to needless worrying, but the more I tried to convince myself that all was well with Powell, and that the dots I had seen on his trail were antelope or wild horses, the less I was able to assure myself. Since we had entered the territory, we had not seen a hostile Indian, and we had, therefore, become careless in the extreme. We were wont to ridicule the stories we had heard of the great numbers of vicious marauders who were said to haunt the trails, taking their toll in lives and torture from every white party which fell into their merciless clutches. Powell, I knew, was well armed and, further, an experienced Indian fighter. But I, too, had lived and fought for years among the Sioux in the north, and I knew his chances were small against a party of cunning trailing Apaches. Finally, I could endure the suspense no longer, and, arming myself with my 2 Colt revolvers and a carbine, I strapped on 2 belts of cartridges, caught my saddle horse, and started down the trail Powell had taken in the morning. As soon as I reached comparatively level ground, I urged my mount into a canter and maintained this pace where the terrain permitted. By dusk, I discovered a point where other tracks joined those of Powell. They were the tracks of unshod ponies, 3 of them, and the ponies had been galloping. I followed rapidly until darkness fell, forcing me to halt and await the moon's rise. This pause gave me time to reflect on the wisdom of my pursuit. Perhaps I had exaggerated the danger, conjuring up impossible perils like an over-anxious old housewife. When I caught up with Powell, I might well find myself laughed at for my efforts. Yet, I have never been one to let fear of ridicule deter me from following what I perceive as my duty. Throughout my life, the pursuit of duty has been a guiding principle, a sort of personal creed. Perhaps this explains the honors bestowed upon me by 3 republics and the decorations awarded by an old and powerful emperor, as well as several lesser kings, for whom my sword has been bloodied many times. By 9 o'clock, the moonlight was bright enough to continue, and I proceeded along the trail at a brisk pace. I alternated between a fast walk and a trot, depending on the terrain, until around midnight, when I reached the water hole where Powell had planned to camp. To my surprise, the spot was entirely deserted, with no signs of recent occupation. The tracks of the pursuing horsemen, whom I now had no doubt were Apaches, continued from the water hole. They had paused only briefly to drink, and had maintained the same relentless speed as Powell. Convinced that they intended to capture him alive for the sadistic pleasure of torturing him, I urged my horse onward at a reckless pace, desperate to reach him before it was too late. My speculation was abruptly interrupted by the faint sound of 2 gunshots ahead. Knowing Powell needed me now more than ever, I pushed my horse to its utmost speed, forcing it up the narrow and treacherous mountain trail. I had covered perhaps a mile when the trail suddenly opened onto a small plateau near the summit of the pass. Just moments before, I had passed through a narrow, overhanging gorge, and the sight that greeted me upon emerging filled me with shock and dismay. The plateau was dotted with Indian teeps, and at least 500 warriors clustered around an object at the center of the camp. Their attention was so riveted that they failed to notice my approach. I could have retreated into the darkness of the gorge and escaped unnoticed, but such a thought did not occur to me until long after. This omission removes any claim to heroism that this episode might otherwise suggest. I do not believe I possess the qualities that make a hero. In the countless instances where my actions have brought me face to face with death, I cannot recall ever pausing to consider alternatives until well after the fact. My mind seems predisposed to follow the path of duty without the hindrance of extended deliberation. Though I have never regretted this instinctive response, it does leave little room for fear or cowardice to take root. In this case, I had no doubt that Powell was the center of the commotion. Without hesitation, I drew my revolvers and charged headlong into the camp, firing rapidly and shouting at the top of my lungs. This reckless attack was perhaps the best strategy under the circumstances. Startled by the unexpected onslaught, the warriors assumed a larger force was upon them and scattered in all directions, scrambling for their weapons. As the camp dispersed, I saw Powell lying motionless under the moonlight. His body bristled with arrows, leaving no doubt that he was already dead. Despite this grim realization, I was determined to save his body from mutilation, even if I could no longer save his life. Riding up to him, I leaned from the saddle, grasped his cartridge belt, and pulled him across the withers of my mount. Realizing that retreating through the gorge would be far more perilous than crossing the plateau, I spurred my horse toward the opening of the pass on the far side. By this time, the Indians had realized I was alone. They pursued me with curses, arrows, and rifle fire, but their aim was poor, hindered by the moonlight and the confusion of my unexpected charge. The speed of my horse and the uneven terrain carried me safely to the shadowed peaks surrounding the plateau before an organized pursuit could be mounted. My horse, left largely unguided, instinctively chose a defile leading toward the summit of the range rather than the pass I had intended to follow. Though unplanned, this deviation likely saved my life and set the stage for the remarkable adventures that would follow in the years ahead. I first realized I was on the wrong trail when the yells of the pursuing warriors grew fainter and fainter, far off to my left. Glancing back, I saw them disappear around the jagged rock formation bordering the plateau, while my horse had carried me and Powell's body to the right. I reined in on a small promontory overlooking the trail below and saw the Apaches rounding the bend of a distant peak. They would soon realize their error and renew their search in the correct direction once they found my tracks. I continued onward and soon discovered what appeared to be a promising trail winding along the face of a high cliff. The path was level, broad, and seemed to lead in the direction I wished to go. On my right, the cliff rose several hundred feet, while to my left was a sheer drop into a rocky ravine. After following this trail for about 100 yards, I came to the mouth of a large cave. The opening was about 4 feet high and 3 to 4 feet wide, and the trail ended here. Morning had arrived without warning, as is typical in Arizona, where dawn often transitions abruptly to full daylight. Dismounting, I laid Powell's body gently on the ground. Despite knowing he was beyond help, I worked over him tirelessly, forcing water from my canteen between his lips, bathing his face, and rubbing his hands. After nearly an hour of fruitless effort, I was forced to accept the truth. Powell was gone. With a heavy heart, I left his body on the ledge and entered the cave to investigate. The chamber was vast, possibly 100 feet in diameter and 30 to 40 feet high. The floor was smooth and well-worn, and other signs suggested that it had once been inhabited. The back of the cave was lost in dense shadow, and I could not determine whether it led to other rooms. As I explored, an inexplicable drowsiness overcame me. At first, I attributed it to exhaustion from the long ride and the tension of the pursuit. Feeling relatively safe in this location, I allowed myself to relax, though I knew I could not afford to sleep. The Apaches might find me at any moment. Struggling to resist, I made my way toward the cave entrance, but dizziness overwhelmed me. Staggering against the wall, I collapsed onto the floor, slipping into unconsciousness. Chapter 2. The Escape of the Dead. A sense of delicious dreaminess overcame me. My muscles relaxed, and I was on the point of giving way to my desire to sleep when the sound of approaching horses reached my ears. I attempted to spring to my feet, but was horrified to discover that my muscles refused to respond to my will. I was now thoroughly awake, yet unable to move a prisoner in my own body, as though turned to stone. It was then, for the first time, that I noticed a slight vapor filling the cave. It was extremely tenuous and only noticeable against the daylight filtering through the opening. A faintly pungent odor reached my nostrils, and I could only assume I had been overcome by some poisonous gas. But why I should retain my mental faculties and yet be unable to move, I could not fathom. I lay facing the opening of the cave, through which I could see the short stretch of trail between the cave and the turn of the cliff. The sound of the approaching horses had ceased, and I judged the Indians were creeping stealthily along the ledge, advancing toward what was fast becoming my living tomb. I remember hoping they would make short work of me, as I did not relish the thought of the innumerable horrors they might inflict if the spirit prompted them. I did not have long to wait before a stealthy sound apprised me of their nearness. Then, a war-bonneted, paint-streaked face cautiously appeared around the shoulder of the cliff, and savage eyes locked with mine. In the dim light of the cave, I was sure he could see me, for the early morning sun fell full upon me through the opening. The warrior did not approach. He merely stood and stared, his eyes bulging and his jaw slack. Then another savage face appeared, and a third, and a fourth, craning their necks over the shoulders of those before them on the narrow ledge. Each face reflected awe and fear, but for what reason, I did not know, nor did I learn until 10 years later. That there were more braves behind the leaders was apparent from the whispered words passed down the line. Suddenly, a low but distinct moaning sound issued from the recesses of the cave behind me. As it reached the ears of the Indians, they turned and fled in terror. Panic-stricken, they scrambled for escape, and in their haste, one of the braves was hurled headlong from the cliff to the rocks below. Their wild cries echoed through the canyon for a short time. Then all was still once more. The sound that had frightened them was not repeated, but it was enough to set me speculating on the possible horror lurking in the shadows at my back. Fear is a relative term, and I can only measure my feelings at that time by the dangers I had faced before and those I have endured since. Still, I admit that the sensations I experienced in that moment made every other fear pale in comparison. If that was fear, then may God help the coward, for cowardice is surely its own punishment. To be held paralyzed, with one's back towards some unknown horror, something capable of reducing ferocious Apache warriors to a terrified stampede, seemed to me the last word in fearsome predicaments. Several times, I thought I heard faint sounds behind me, as if something was moving cautiously. Eventually, even these ceased, and I was left to the silence of my predicament. Late in the afternoon, my horse, which had been standing with dragging rein before the cave, started slowly down the trail, evidently in search of food and water. I was left alone with my mysterious, unknown companion and the dead body of my friend, lying just within my field of vision on the ledge. From then until possibly midnight, all was silent. The silence of the dead. Suddenly, the awful moan of the morning broke upon my ears again, and I heard the faint rustling of a moving thing. The sound, though faint, sent a terrible shock through my already overstrained nerves. Desperation gave me the will to fight against my paralysis. I struggled with every ounce of strength in my mind and body, though my limbs refused to respond. And then something gave. There was a moment of nausea, a sharp click as though a steel wire had snapped, and I stood free, my back against the wall of the cave, facing the unknown foe. In that instant, the moonlight flooded the cave. There before me lay my own body, just as it had been all those hours, eyes staring toward the ledge, hands resting limply on the ground. I looked first at my lifeless form and then at myself, standing naked and bewildered. How could this be? I was clothed, yet there lay my body. I touched my arms, my chest, and felt my own warmth. My heart pounded against my ribs, and my breath came in short, quick gasps. This was no dream. A sudden moan from the depths of the cave recalled me to my situation. Naked and unarmed, I had no desire to face the unseen thing that menaced me. My revolvers were strapped to the lifeless body before me, and my carbine was with my saddle, far down the trail where my horse had wandered. Flight seemed my only option, and the faint rustling sound from the shadows crystallized my decision. Whatever was in that cave was now creeping toward me. Unable to resist the urge to escape, I leapt through the opening into the crisp, clear Arizona night. The fresh mountain air invigorated me, filling me with new life and courage. I paused on the brink of the ledge, upbraiding myself for what now seemed like unwarranted apprehension. Surely the noises I had heard were harmless, perhaps caused by a slight breeze moving through the cave. I decided to investigate, but first I lifted my head to fill my lungs with the pure, invigorating night air of the mountains. As I did so, I saw, stretching far below me, the beautiful vista of a rocky gorge and a level, cacti-studded flat, transformed by the moonlight into a miracle of soft splendor and wondrous enchantment. Few Western wonders are more inspiring than the beauty of an Arizona moonlit landscape. The silvered mountains in the distance, the strange interplay of lights and shadows upon the rugged hogbacks and arroyos, and the grotesque yet striking details of the stiff, majestic cacti combine to form a picture both enchanting and awe-inspiring. It is as though one were catching, for the last time, a glimpse of some dead and forgotten world. So utterly distinct is it from the appearance of any other place on earth. As I stood there, breathing deeply, my gaze turned from the ledge to the heavens, where the myriad stars formed a gorgeous canopy over the rugged landscape. One star in particular caught my eye, a large red star low on the horizon. It was Mars, the god of war, and for me, a fighting man, it had always held a peculiar fascination. That night, it seemed to call to me across the void, to lure me toward it, to draw me as a lodestone draws iron. As the spell of that crimson light deepened, I stretched out my arms toward it, my longing beyond the power of opposition. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I felt myself drawn with suddenness and force through the unthinkable void of space. There was an instant of utter darkness and intense cold. Chapter 3. My Advent on Mars. I opened my eyes upon a strange and weird landscape. I knew that I was on Mars. Not once did I question either my sanity or my wakefulness. I was not asleep. No need for pinching here. My inner consciousness told me plainly that I was upon Mars as surely as your conscious mind tells you that you are upon Earth. You do not question the fact, neither did I. I found myself lying prone upon a bed of yellowish, moss-like vegetation that stretched around me in all directions for interminable miles. I seemed to be lying in a deep, circular basin, along the outer verge of which I could distinguish the irregularities of low hills. It was midday. The sun was shining full upon me, and the heat of it was rather intense upon my naked body, yet no greater than would have been true under similar conditions on an Arizona desert. Here and there were slight outcroppings of quartz-bearing rock which glistened in the sunlight. A little to my left, perhaps 100 yards away, appeared a low, walled enclosure about 4 feet in height. No water and no other vegetation than the moss were in evidence, and as I was somewhat thirsty, I determined to do a little exploring. Springing to my feet, I received my first Martian surprise, for the effort, which on Earth would have brought me to a standing position, carried me into the Martian air to the height of about 3 yards. I alighted softly upon the ground, however, without appreciable shock or jar. Now commenced a series of evolutions which, even then, seemed ludicrous in the extreme. I found that I must learn to walk all over again, as the muscular exertion which carried me easily and safely upon Earth played strange antics with me upon Mars. Instead of progressing in a sane and dignified manner, my attempts to walk resulted in a variety of hops which took me clear of the ground a couple of feet at each step and landed me sprawling upon my face or back at the end of every second or third hop. My muscles, perfectly attuned and accustomed to the force of gravity on Earth, played mischief with me in attempting for the first time to cope with the lesser gravitation and lower air pressure on Mars. I was determined, however, to explore the low structure, which was the only evidence of habitation in sight, and so I hit upon the unique plan of reverting to first principles and locomotion creeping. I did fairly well at this, and, in a few moments, had reached the low encircling wall of the enclosure. There appeared to be no doors or windows upon the side nearest me, but as the wall was but about 4 feet high, I cautiously gained my feet and peered over the top upon the strangest sight it had ever been given me to see. The roof of the enclosure was of solid glass about 4 or 5 inches in thickness, and beneath this were several hundred large eggs, perfectly round and snowy white. The eggs were nearly uniform in size, being about 2.5 feet in diameter. 5 or 6 had already hatched, and the grotesque caricatures that sat blinking in the sunlight were enough to cause me to doubt my sanity. They seemed mostly head, with little scrawny bodies, long necks, and 6 limbs, or, as I afterward learned, 2 legs and 2 arms, with an intermediary pair of limbs which could be used at will either as arms or legs. Their eyes were set at the extreme sides of their heads, a trifle above the center, and protruded in such a manner that they could be directed either forward or back, and also independently of each other, thus permitting this queer animal to look in any direction, or in 2 directions at once without the necessity of turning the head. The ears, which were slightly above the eyes and closer together, were small, cup-shaped antennae, protruding not more than an inch on these young specimens. Their noses were but longitudinal slits in the center of their faces, midway between their mouths and ears. There was no hair on their bodies, which were of a very light yellowish green color. In the adults, as I was to learn quite soon, this color deepens to an olive green and is darker in the male than in the female. Further, the heads of the adults are not so out of proportion to their bodies as in the case of the young. The iris of the eyes is blood red, as in albinos, while the pupil is dark. The eyeball itself is very white, as are the teeth. These latter add a most ferocious appearance to an otherwise fearsome and terrible countenance, as the lower tusks curve upward to sharp points, which end about where the eyes of earthly human beings are located. The whiteness of the teeth is not that of ivory, but of the snowiest and most gleaming of china. Against the dark background of their olive skins, their tusks stand out in a most striking manner, making these weapons present a singularly formidable appearance. Most of these details I noted later, for I was given but little time to speculate on the wonders of my new discovery. I had seen that the eggs were in the process of hatching, and as I stood watching the hideous little monsters break from their shells, I failed to note the approach of a score of full-grown Martians from behind me. Coming, as they did, over the soft and soundless moss which covers practically the entire surface of Mars, with the exception of the frozen areas at the poles and the scattered cultivated districts, they might have captured me easily. But their intentions were far more sinister. It was the rattling of the accoutrements of the foremost warrior that warned me. On such a little thing my life hung that I often marvel that I escaped so easily. Had not the rifle of the leader of the party swung from its fastenings beside his saddle in such a way as to strike against the butt of his great, metal-shod spear, I should have been snuffed out without ever knowing that death was near me. But the little sound caused me to turn, and there upon me, not 10 feet from my breast, was the point of that huge spear, a spear 40 feet long, tipped with gleaming metal, and held low at the side of a mounted replica of the little devils I had been watching. But how puny and harmless they now looked beside this huge and terrific incarnation of hate, vengeance, and death. The man himself, for such I may call him, was fully 15 feet in height and, on earth, would have weighed some 400 pounds. He sat his mount as we sit a horse, grasping the animal's barrel with his lower limbs, while the hands of his 2 right arms held his immense spear low at the side of his mount. His 2 left arms were outstretched laterally to help preserve his balance, the thing he rode having neither bridle nor reins for guidance. And his mount. How can earthly words describe it? It towered 10 feet at the shoulder, had 4 legs on either side, and a broad, flat tail, larger at the tip than at the root, which it held straight out behind while running. Its gaping mouth split its head from snout to its long, massive neck. Like its master, it was entirely devoid of hair, but was a dark slate color, exceedingly smooth and glossy. Its belly was white, and its legs shaded from the slate of its shoulders and hips to a vivid yellow at the feet. The feet themselves were heavily padded and nailless, contributing to the noiselessness of their approach. In common with the fauna of Mars, a multiplicity of legs was characteristic. The highest type of Martian man and 1 other animal, the only mammal on Mars alone, had well-formed nails, and hoofed animals were entirely absent. Behind this first charging demon trailed 19 others, similar in all respects, but, as I later learned, bearing individual characteristics peculiar to themselves, just as no 2 humans are identical, though we are cast in a similar mold. This picture, or rather materialized nightmare which I have described at length, made one terrible and swift impression upon me as I turned to meet it. Unarmed and naked as I was, The first law of nature manifested itself in the only possible solution to my immediate problem that was to get out of the vicinity of the point of the charging spear. Consequently, I made a very earthly yet superhuman leap to the top of the Martian incubator, as I had determined it must be. My effort was crowned with a success that appalled me no less than it seemed to astonish the Martian warriors, for it carried me fully 30 feet into the air and landed me 100 feet away from my pursuers, on the opposite side of the enclosure. I landed easily upon the soft moss without mishap, and, turning, saw my enemies lined up along the far wall. Some were surveying me with expressions of what I later understood to be astonishment, while others were evidently confirming that I had not harmed their young. They conversed in low tones, gesticulating and pointing toward me. Their realization that I had neither harmed the little Martians nor was armed seemed to temper their ferocity. Yet, as I would later learn, it was my exhibition of hurdling that weighed most in my favor. Though immense in size, the Martians' bones were large and their musculature adapted only to the weaker gravitational pull of Mars. This meant they were agile but less powerful, pound for pound, than an Earthman. I doubt that a Martian suddenly transported to Earth could lift his own weight from the ground. In fact, I am convinced he could not. My feat, then, was as marvelous to them as it would have been on Earth. Their hostility gave way to amazement, and I became a fascinating discovery to be captured and exhibited rather than annihilated. The respite my agility granted allowed me to consider my next move and observe the warriors more closely. Their weapons intrigued me. In addition to their huge spears, they carried firearms that seemed remarkably efficient. These rifles, made of a white metal and stocked with a very light, intensely hard wood unique to Mars, were deadly. The barrels, composed of a tempered alloy of aluminum and steel, exceeded the hardness of any steel known on Earth. With their small caliber, explosive radium projectiles, and great barrel length, these rifles were both lightweight and devastating. Their effective range, equipped with wireless finders and sighters, extended theoretically to 300 miles, though practical usage was closer to 200. This weaponry discouraged any immediate attempt to escape. A telepathic instinct seemed to warn me against trying to flee under the muzzles of 20 of these death-dealing machines. After a brief discussion, the Martians turned and rode off in the direction they had come, leaving one warrior behind near the enclosure. When the group halted a couple of 100 yards away, their leader dismounted, threw down his spear and sidearms, and began walking toward me, unarmed and adorned only with the ornaments strapped to his head, limbs, and chest. As he approached within 50 feet, he unclasped an enormous metal armlet, held it toward me in his open palm, and addressed me in a clear, resonant voice. I could not understand his language, but his actions spoke of peace. Hoping to respond in kind, I placed my hand over my heart, bowed low, and, with a smile, stretched out my hand to take the armlet. I clasped it above my elbow and stood waiting. The Martian's wide mouth spread into a smile as he locked one of his intermediary arms in mine. Together, we walked toward his mount, and he motioned for his followers to advance. As they approached at a run, he signaled them to halt, likely fearing I might again leap out of sight. After exchanging a few words with his men, he motioned for me to ride behind one of them and then mounted his own animal. The designated warrior extended several hands and lifted me onto the glossy back of his mount, where I clung to the belts and straps of his weapons and ornaments. The entire cavalcade then turned and galloped away toward a distant range of hills. Chapter 4. A Prisoner. We had gone perhaps 10 miles when the ground began to rise very rapidly. We were, as I was later to learn, nearing the edge of one of Mars' long dead seas. in the bottom of which my encounter with the Martians had taken place. In a short time, we reached the foot of the mountains, and after traversing a narrow gorge, we came to an open valley. At the far extremity of this valley lay a low tableland, upon which I beheld an enormous city. Toward this we galloped, entering by what appeared to be a ruined roadway leading out from the city, but only to the edge of the tableland, where it ended abruptly in a flight of broad steps. As we passed the buildings, I noticed that they were deserted. Though not greatly decayed, they bore the appearance of having been uninhabited for years, possibly even ages. Toward the center of the city was a large plaza, and upon this and in the surrounding buildings were camped some 900 or 1000 creatures of the same breed as my captors. For such I now considered them, despite the deceptive politeness with which they had ensnared me. With the exception of their ornaments, all were naked. The women differed little in appearance from the men, except that their tusks were much larger in proportion to their height, in some cases curving nearly to their high-set ears. Their bodies were smaller and lighter in color, and their fingers and toes bore rudimentary nails, which the males entirely lacked. The adult females ranged in height from 10 to 12 feet. The children were lighter in color, even more so than the women, and they all looked precisely alike to me, except that some were taller than others, older, I presumed. I saw no signs of extreme age among them. There was no appreciable difference in their appearance from the age of maturity, about 40, until, at around the age of 1,000 years, they voluntarily embarked on their final pilgrimage down the river Iasis. This mysterious river led to destinations unknown to any living Martian, for none who had ventured upon its cold, dark waters had ever returned or would be allowed to live if they did. Only about 1 Martian in 1,000 dies from sickness or disease, while possibly about 20 take the voluntary pilgrimage. The remaining 979 meet violent deaths in duels, hunting, aviation, or war. However, by far the greatest death toll comes during childhood, when many young Martians fall victim to the great white apes of Mars. The average life expectancy of a Martian after maturity is approximately 300 years. It might approach 1,000 were it not for the numerous violent causes of death. Due to the planet's dwindling resources, the increasing longevity produced by their advanced therapeutic and surgical skills seems to have necessitated a counterbalance. As a result, human life is considered lightly on Mars, evidenced by their dangerous sports and the almost continual warfare between communities. There are natural causes for the reduction in population, but none are as significant as the fact that no Martian, male or female, is ever voluntarily without a weapon of destruction. As we neared the plaza, my presence was discovered, and we were immediately surrounded by hundreds of the creatures. They seemed eager to pluck me from my seat behind my guard. A single word from the leader of the party silenced their clamor, and we proceeded across the plaza at a trot, heading for the entrance of one of the most magnificent edifices I had ever seen. The building was low but covered an enormous area. It was constructed of gleaming white marble inlaid with gold and brilliant stones that sparkled and scintillated in the sunlight. The main entrance, some 100 feet in width, projected outward to form a massive canopy over the entrance hall. There was no stairway, but a gentle incline led to the first floor, which opened into an enormous chamber encircled by galleries. This chamber, dotted with elaborately carved wooden desks and chairs, was occupied by 40 or 50 male Martians gathered around the steps of a rostrum. Upon the platform squatted an enormous warrior adorned with metal ornaments, vibrant feathers, and intricately crafted leather trappings studded with precious stones. A short cape of white fur lined with brilliant scarlet silk hung from his shoulders. What struck me most about this assemblage was the stark disproportion between the Martians and the furnishings. The desks and chairs were clearly designed for human beings of my size, while the massive bulk of the Martians would have made it impossible for them to fit. Their long legs could not have been accommodated beneath the desks. Evidently, these buildings and their furnishings belonged to a race long extinct, whose memory lingered only in these ancient structures. Our party halted at the entrance, and at a sign from the leader, I was lowered to the ground. Locking his arm in mine, my captor escorted me into the audience chamber. Few formalities were observed. My captor strode up to the rostrum, the other Martians making way for him. The chieftain rose to his feet and uttered my captor's name, who in turn repeated the chieftain's name and title. At the time, I could not understand this ceremony, but I later learned it was the customary greeting among green Martians. Strangers, unable to exchange names, would silently exchange ornaments if their missions were peaceful, otherwise, they would exchange fire or fight with other weapons. My captor's name was Tars Tarkas, and he was virtually the vice chieftain of the community, a skilled warrior and statesman. He briefly explained the events leading to my capture. When he finished, the chieftain addressed me at length. I replied in English, knowing full well he wouldn't understand. But I noticed that when I smiled slightly, he did the same. This mutual smile led me to believe we had some common ground, a shared sense of humor. I later learned, however, that the Martian smile is purely perfunctory, and their sense of humor is grotesquely alien to ours. The death agonies of a fellow being are, to them, a source of great hilarity, and their chief amusement lies in devising torturous methods of execution for their prisoners of war. The warriors and chieftains examined me closely, feeling my muscles and skin. The chieftain then motioned me to follow him and Tars Tarkas out to the open plaza. My attempts to walk, as before, resulted in awkward skipping and flitting, much to their amusement. When I resorted to crawling, a towering warrior roughly jerked me to my feet. In response, I struck him squarely on the jaw, and he fell like an ox. Expecting retaliation, I braced myself for a fight, but the other Martians simply laughed and applauded. I later learned this reaction was a rare sign of approval. The fellow whom I had struck lay where he had fallen, and none of his mates approached him. Tars Tarkas advanced toward me, extending one of his arms, and together we proceeded to the plaza without further mishap. I did not, of course, know the reason for which we had come to the open, but I was not long in being enlightened. They first repeated the word sack several times, and then Tars Tarkas made a series of jumps, repeating the word before each leap. Turning to me, he said, "Sack." I understood what they were after, and, gathering myself together, I leaped with such marvelous success that I cleared a good 150 feet. This time, I did not lose my balance and landed squarely on my feet without falling. I then returned with easy jumps of 25 or 30 feet to the group of warriors. My exhibition had been witnessed by several hundred lesser Martians, and they immediately broke into demands for a repetition, which the chieftain ordered me to perform. However, I was both hungry and thirsty, and decided that my only means of salvation was to demand consideration from these creatures, who evidently would not voluntarily offer it. I ignored their repeated commands to sack, and each time they were made, I pointed to my mouth and rubbed my stomach. Tars Tarkas and the chief exchanged a few words. The former then called to a young female among the throng, gave her some instructions, and motioned for me to accompany her. I grasped her offered arm, and together we crossed the plaza toward a large building on the far side. My fair companion was about 8 feet tall, having just reached maturity, but not yet her full height. She had a light olive green color with a smooth, glossy hide. Her name, as I later learned, was Sola, and she was part of Tars Tarkas's retinue. She guided me to a spacious chamber in one of the buildings fronting the plaza. From the litter of silk and furs on the floor, I assumed it was the sleeping quarters of several natives. The room was well lit by several large windows and beautifully decorated with mural paintings and mosaics. However, there was an indefinable air of antiquity that convinced me the architects and builders of these wondrous creations had little in common with the crude, half-brutish beings now occupying them. Sola motioned for me to sit on a pile of silks near the center of the room. Turning, she made a peculiar hissing sound, as though signaling someone in an adjoining room. In response to her call, I obtained my first sight of a new Martian wonder. It waddled in on 10 short legs and squatted before the girl like an obedient puppy. The creature was about the size of a Shetland pony, but its head bore a slight resemblance to that of a frog, except its jaws were equipped with 3 rows of long, sharp tusks. Chapter 5. I elude my watchdog. Sola stared into the brute's wicked-looking eyes, muttered a word or two of command, pointed to me, and left the chamber. I could not help but wonder what this ferocious-looking monstrosity might do when left alone with such a relatively tender morsel of meat. My fears, however, were groundless. After surveying me intently for a moment, the beast crossed the room to the only exit leading to the street and lay down full length across the threshold. This was my first experience with a Martian watchdog, but it was destined not to be my last. This fellow guarded me carefully during the time I remained a captive among the green men. Twice, he saved my life, and he was never voluntarily away from me for a moment. While Sola was away, I examined the room in which I found myself captive. The mural paintings depicted scenes of rare and wonderful beauty. Mountains, rivers, lakes, oceans, meadows, trees, flowers, winding roadways, and sunlit gardens. These might have portrayed earthly views, but for the different colorations of the vegetation. The work had evidently been crafted by a master hand. So subtle was the atmosphere and so perfect the technique. Yet nowhere in the paintings was there a representation of a living creature, neither human nor beast, by which I might guess the likeness of Mars's other, perhaps extinct, denizens. While allowing my imagination to run wild with conjectures about the strange anomalies I had encountered on Mars, Sola returned, bearing food and drink. She placed these on the floor beside me, seated herself a short distance away, and regarded me intently. The food consisted of a pound of a solid substance, somewhat like cheese in consistency, but almost tasteless. The liquid appeared to be milk, but with a slightly acidic flavor. It was not unpleasant, and, in time, I came to prize it highly. Later, I discovered that it did not come from an animal, as there is only one mammal on Mars, and that one very rare, but rather from a large plant. This plant grows with little water and distills its milk-like substance from the soil, air moisture, and sunlight. A single plant can produce 8 to 10 quarts of milk per day. After eating, I felt greatly invigorated, but soon stretched out upon the silks and fell asleep. I must have slept for several hours, for it was dark when I awoke, and I was very cold. I noticed that someone had thrown a fur over me, but it had become partially dislodged. In the darkness, I struggled to replace it. Suddenly, a hand reached out, pulled the fur over me, and shortly afterward added another layer to my covering. I presumed my watchful guardian was Sola, and I was correct. Among all the green Martians I encountered, She alone exhibited characteristics of sympathy, kindness, and affection. Her ministrations to my needs were unfailing, and her solicitous care spared me from much suffering and many hardships. The Martian nights are extremely cold, with rapid and uncomfortable temperature changes due to the lack of atmosphere. The transition from brilliant daylight to darkness is sudden, as is the onset of cold. On nights when neither of Mars' two moons is visible, the darkness is almost total. However, when one or both moons are in the sky, the ground is brightly illuminated. Mars' moons are much closer to the planet than our moon is to Earth. The nearer moon is about 5,000 miles away, while the farther one is just over 14,000 miles distant. Compared to the nearly 250,000 miles separating Earth from its moon, the closer moon completes a revolution around Mars in just over 7.5 hours, crossing the sky like a huge meteor 2 or 3 times each night, revealing all its phases in a single transit. The farther moon takes slightly more than 30 hours to orbit the planet, and together they create a nocturnal scene of eerie and splendid grandeur. After Sola replenished my coverings, I slept again and did not awaken until daylight. The other occupants of the room, 5 females, were still sleeping, piled high with a motley array of silks and furs. Across the threshold lay the sleepless brood, just as I had last seen him. He appeared not to have moved a muscle. His eyes were glued on me. I began to wonder what might happen if I attempted to escape. Adventure has always tempted me, and I often investigate and experiment where wiser men might tread carefully. I decided that the best way to understand the brute's attitude toward me was to attempt leaving the room. Confident in my jumping abilities, I believed I could outmaneuver him if necessary. Furthermore, his short legs suggested he was neither a jumper nor a runner. Slowly and cautiously, I stood up, only to see the brute do the same. Shuffling toward him, I discovered that this gait allowed me to maintain my balance and move reasonably quickly. As I approached, he backed away, and when I reached the doorway, he stepped aside to let me pass. He then fell in behind me, trailing about 10 paces as I walked along the deserted street. At first, I thought his mission was merely to protect me, but when we reached the edge of the city, he suddenly sprang in front of me, emitting strange sounds and baring his ferocious tusks. Amused by his reaction, I rushed toward him, leaping high into the air and landing far beyond him, outside the city. To my astonishment, he wheeled instantly and charged at me with incredible speed, far swifter than I had anticipated. His short legs did not hinder him. Indeed, he moved with an appalling swiftness that would have left Earth's greyhounds looking sluggish. As I would later learn, this creature is the fleetest on Mars, prized for its intelligence, loyalty, and ferocity in hunting, in war, and as a guardian. Realizing I couldn't outrun him in a straight course, I doubled back, leaping over him just as he was about to reach me. This maneuver gave me a significant advantage, and I managed to reach the city ahead of him. As he tore after me, I leapt for a window about 30 feet from the ground in one of the buildings overlooking the valley. Grasping the sill, I pulled myself up to a sitting position without looking inside. I glanced down at the baffled creature below, feeling a brief moment of triumph. However, my exultation was short-lived. Scarcely had I gained a secure seat when a massive hand seized me by the neck from behind and dragged me violently into the room. Thrown upon my back, I looked up to see a colossal, ape-like creature towering over me. It was white and hairless, except for a thick shock of bristly hair atop its head. Chapter 6. A Fight That Won Friends. The thing, which more closely resembled our earthly men than it did the Martians I had seen, held me pinned to the ground with one huge foot while it jabbered and gesticulated at some answering creature behind me. This other, which was evidently its mate, soon came toward us, bearing a mighty stone cudgel with which it evidently intended to strike me down. The creatures were about 10 or 15 feet tall, standing erect, and had, like the green Martians, an intermediary set of limbs midway between their upper and lower limbs. Their eyes were close together and non-protruding. Their ears were high-set, though positioned more laterally than those of the green Martians, while their snouts and teeth bore a striking resemblance to those of our African gorilla. Altogether, they were less grotesque than the green Martians, though still fearsome to behold. The cudgel was swinging in an arc that would have ended on my upturned face when a bolt of multi-legged horror hurled itself through the doorway full upon the breast of my would-be executioner. With a shriek of fear, the ape that held me leaped through the open window, but its mate closed in a terrific death struggle with my savior, none other than my faithful Martian watchbeast. Though I cannot bring myself to call so hideous a creature a dog, it had proven its loyalty once again. As quickly as possible, I gained my feet and, backing against the wall, watched the titanic struggle. The strength, agility, and ferocity of these two creatures was unparalleled by anything I had ever witnessed on Earth. My beast had the initial advantage, having sunk its mighty fangs deep into the breast of its adversary. But the great arms and paws of the ape, backed by muscles that far exceeded those of any earthly creature, had locked around the throat of my guardian, choking the life from it and bending its head backward upon its body. At any moment, I expected my protector's neck to snap under the immense strain. The ape, in its effort to subdue the beast, was tearing away its own breast as my beast's jaws clamped down with unyielding strength. The room echoed with the sounds of their furious struggle, yet neither creature made a sound of pain or fear. Their movements slowed, and I saw my beast's great eyes bulging from their sockets, blood streaming from its nostrils. It was weakening, but so too was the ape. Suddenly, I was seized by a sense of duty. With a strange instinct that always seems to prompt me to act at such moments, I seized the cudgel that had fallen to the floor and, with all the strength of my earthly arms, I brought it down full upon the head of the ape. Its skull cracked under the blow as though it were an eggshell. Scarcely had the ape fallen when I was confronted by a new danger. Its mate, having recovered from its initial shock, returned by way of the interior of the building. I glimpsed him just before it reached the doorway, its rage evident as it roared and foamed at the mouth upon seeing its lifeless fellow sprawled on the floor. I must confess to feeling a wave of dread. While I am willing to stand and fight when the odds are not overwhelming, I saw no glory in pitting my relatively puny strength against this enraged creature. It seemed clear that my only reward would be death. Standing near the window, I calculated that if I fled to the street, I might gain the plaza and safety before the creature could overtake me. It seemed a slim chance, but better than facing it directly. However, as I turned to flee, my gaze fell upon my wounded watchbeast. It lay gasping on the floor, its great eyes fixed on me in a pitiful appeal for protection. I could not ignore that look, nor could I, upon reflection, desert the creature that had twice saved my life. Resolving to face the ape, I turned to meet its charge. The creature bore down on me with terrifying speed. The cudgel, though still in my grasp, would be of little use against its multiple arms. As the ape lunged forward, I threw the weapon as hard as I could. It struck the creature below the knees, eliciting a howl of pain and momentarily throwing it off balance. Before it could recover, I swung my right fist full upon its jaw and followed with a smashing blow to the pit of its stomach. The effects were remarkable. The ape reeled, doubled over, and fell gasping to the floor. Leaping over its prostrate body, I seized the cudgel and, with one final blow, ended the creature's life. As the ape collapsed, a low laugh rang out behind me. Turning, I saw Tars Tarkas, Sola, and 3 or 4 other Martian warriors standing in the doorway. Their faces were twisted with mirth as they watched my struggle. For the second time, I was the recipient of their rare applause. Sola, who had noted my absence upon waking, had informed Tars Tarkas, who immediately set out with a small party to search for me. They had followed the bull ape into the building, suspecting it might lead them to me, and arrived just in time to witness the fight. This encounter, combined with my earlier feats of jumping and my scuffle with the Martian warrior the day before, elevated me to a position of great esteem among the green Martians. Though they seemed devoid of the finer emotions, they revered physical prowess and bravery above all else. For now, I was the object of their admiration. Sola, unlike the others, displayed no laughter or amusement. She rushed to my side as soon as the battle ended, examining me for wounds with evident concern. Satisfied that I was unscathed, she smiled quietly and took my hand, leading me toward the door. The other Martians gathered around the watch beast, which was now slowly recovering. A warrior, pistol in hand, prepared to end the creature's life. I sprang forward and struck his arm upward just as he fired, sending the bullet into the wooden casing of the window, where it exploded in a burst of splinters and masonry. I knelt beside the beast, helping it to its feet, and motioned for it to follow me. The Martians looked on in astonishment. Their culture seemed unable to grasp such concepts as gratitude or compassion. The warrior looked questioningly at Tars Tarkas, who signaled for me to proceed as I wished. Thus, we returned to the Plaza Sola at my side, and my great beast trailing obediently at my heels. On Mars, I had found 2 unlikely allies, a young woman who watched over me with motherly care, and a fierce, loyal creature who carried in its monstrous frame more love and gratitude than the entire 5 million green Martians combined who rove the deserted cities and dead sea bottoms of the Mars.
Thank you so much for joining me today and listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. If you liked today's tale, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to see you next time for another magical adventure. Until then, take care and keep imagining.